So I wanted to talk about something that we've talked about a little bit before, but it's becoming more and more interesting as we get more and more Zoan Fruit users in the series of One Piece. Also, spoilers for Elbaf. However, when it comes to Zoan Fruits, the physiology, the age, the experience, and the size of the user all matter to the transformations of the Zoan fruit, which is something quite interesting because you don't really get to see these many requirements play out when talking about a Paramecia type Devil fruit or a Logia type Devil fruit. And what I mean by that is when you look at characters who are non-human for the most part, like your Kaidos or your Choppers, the Devil fruit in question will have a different effect on them than it would a normal human. And you really get to see this with Kaido and Momonosuke. Momonosuke only has one set of horns, but Kaido has two. And I think the reason why this is because his form doesn't really neatly overlap with the form of the dragon. Therefore, he has two sets of horns. And what's interesting about him and Momonosuke is that their dragon forms do change as they age. With Kaido, in the Elbaf flashback, when he is a rocks pirate and he eats the fruit for the first time, the whiskers of the dragon are blue. They aren't colored in because he hasn't grown his weird long mustache yet. The same thing happens with Momonosuke. When Momonosuke is an 8-year-old child, he does not have the flame cloud rings around his limbs. Therefore, he can't just take off and fly. However, when he becomes a 28-year-old, at least in body, he gets those flame cloud rings around his limbs, and therefore he can fly. All the other abilities are a little hard for him, and that's because he's not well experienced, which we see that too with Kaido. He kind of just comes up with a fire breath move on the spot. And that could just be because he's a bit more seasoned as a combatant. That's why he had a slightly easier time at doing that than Momonosuke. But there isn't much difference there. They were still both inexperienced at the time. And you see this too, actually, with Luffy, which shows you that Oda might have been planning to make Luffy a Zoan for a very long time. I'm not going to say anything crazy like this was decided at the start of the series. No. But when he first has his fruit, he doesn't have a good control over his rubber body. So that's a very interesting sign because we don't see this type of weird mental block with Paramecia users and Logia users. They kind of just do what they need to do off the spot. And then the education required for some Paramecia fruit users is very specific. So with that being said, I do believe if you are a non-human, it's a very high possibility that your unusual traits will appear in the Zoan transformation no matter what form you take. So moving off of that, size 2 seems to be a contributing factor. And this is really shown to us a few times in the series. So again, with Momonosuke, you see that when he is an 8-year-old boy, the dragon is very small. However, when he becomes a 28-year-old man, at least in body, the dragon becomes huge. Now, the weird part about this is that the dragon that he becomes is around the same size as Kaido, even though he and Kaido are not the same size in their normal states. Kaido is a huge, huge man. So I do think there seems to be a size cap in which there doesn't seem to be much effect on the fruit. But if you go beyond that, there is an effect. And we see this way later in Elbaf with Loki and Ragnar, because Ragnar originally was a giant hammer that has eaten some sort of squirrel fruit. And we know that Loki is an ancient giant whom has eaten some sort of mythical dragon fruit. With that being said, we get some very cool size comparisons in chapter 1174, because in that chapter we see Loki's dragon form for the first time, and comparing the sizes of the two, Luffy appears to be in his giant state while in Gear 5th, and he seems to be perhaps twice the size of Ragnar. So we know that Ragnar is a giant squirrel when he is in his full Zoan state, which means his hammer state in being a giant hammer has affected his Zoan state most likely. And this most certainly is the case for Loki, because thanks to the powers of Remo Shifu Killingham, we know what a Nidhogg presumably is supposed to look like and how big it's supposed to be. Perhaps the size of two normal giants, if I were to give a rough estimate. However, with Loki being an ancient giant and being several times larger than a normal giant, he is massive as a mythical full dragon. So his normal state most likely had a very high effect on his Zoan form. Therefore, that brings me to the thought that maybe if you are bigger than the size cap, the Zoan fruit continues to be additive, and you are just a big version of whatever you're supposed to be, no matter what, because you started off in being a large individual. Perhaps that is the case. We do see this a bit too way earlier with Boa Sandersonia and Boa Marigold. They too are fairly large humans, but it's hard to tell with them because we never see their full Zoan states. We only see their hybrid transformations. But I do think that was a hint to show what is possible moving forward in the narrative. So yeah, Zoan fruits are additive at least most of the time, and they don't seem to take traits away if those traits really don't line up with the Zoan fruit in question. This brings us back to Loki as well, because the Nidhogg, in looking at the nightmare creature, does seem to have similar horns to what Loki possesses normally. Therefore, when he becomes a giant mythical dragon, he doesn't get additional horns like what Kaido got, because with Kaido, the horns given to him by the fish fruit model Astro Dragon are more antler-like in appearance, which are way different than the smooth bull-like Oni horns that he has normally. So that's why I think he has two sets of horns, whereas Loki only has one set of horns. But with that being said, if you are enjoying the video so far, give me a like, and if you want to see more of this type of content, hit the subscribe button, and don't forget to ring that bell so you never miss a Pilot P Works video. In addition, could you please hit the hype button, because it does help somehow. But with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede Works.